Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey into, well, a surprisingly nuanced and often pretty ambiguous topic: the intricate world of male intimacy in British history. You've sent us some really compelling sources on British male bonds, historical ambiguity, and our mission today is to really unpack the emotional, physical, and even socio-political layers of same-sex intimacy between British men.
Yeah.
We're especially focusing on how these dynamics played out within, elite and institutional contexts, things like boarding schools, military ranks, aristocratic circles, mainly from the 19th up to the early 20th centuries.
That period is key.
Our core idea for this deep dive is basically that these very specific environments, they actually fostered incredibly intense emotional bonds between men, bonds that frequently blurred the lines, between deep friendship, homoeroticism, and even institutional power.
Absolutely.
These relationships were often quite public, yet somehow coded, sometimes celebrated, sometimes, deeply repressed.
Simultaneously often.
Exactly. It's a story that challenges so many of our modern assumptions and really makes us ask, when does a brotherly touch become something more? When does camaraderie cross into desire?
That's a fantastic framing, because what's truly fascinating here is how our understanding of male intimacy has just shifted so dramatically.
Right.
It's crucial, like you said, not to simply slap modern labels like bromance or, homosexuality onto historical figures. Those concepts are relatively recent constructs.
Yeah, we can't just project backwards.
No. Instead, we'll be navigating what your sources thoughtfully call not straight things through a historically contextualized lens, which means recognizing affection, desire, without forcing today's identities onto the past.
Okay.
This deep dive will really help us distinguish between, say, a broad male homosocial desire, that strong bond between men and homosexuality, as a distinct self-identified identity, which interestingly often emerged specifically alongside societal anxieties and, crucially, legal prohibitions.
Right. Those anxieties and laws really shaped things. So if that's our lens, let's jump right into the heart of where some of these intense bonds were forged. British boarding schools. We often think of them as these, bastions of rigid discipline.
Stiff upper lip territory.
Exactly. But our sources paint them as surprising emotional furnaces. What was really going on in those elite institutions like Eton, Harrow, Winchester?
It's a striking contrast to how we might imagine them now. These schools were, hotbeds of intense intimacy, often quite physical.
Really? Physical how?
Imagine boys and later young men sharing beds. That was a completely normal, unremarkable part of daily life.
Sharing beds, just normally.
Yeah. It wasn't necessarily seen as sexual, but it signified profound trust and emotional closeness. It sort of stemmed from the communal sleeping arrangements of the time.
Okay, that makes sense in context.
And beyond bed sharing, you see practices like fagging, where younger boys served older ones. Now, while that was clearly about hierarchy and servitude.
Yeah, power dynamics.
Definitely. But it inadvertently created these incredibly close, almost familial bonds for some. And then there were the rituals: widespread nudity, rough horseplay, and perhaps surprisingly even rituals of dominance, like ass shaving or mooning the master.
Okay, hang on. Ass shaving and mooning the master. That sounds, pretty provocative, even thinking about it historically. What exactly did those rituals involve, and what does their normalization tell us about male intimacy there?
They were indeed provocative, and often deeply embedded in the school culture. Ass shaving might involve an older boy or a group ritually shaving the backside of a younger, usually incoming student. It was partly initiation, partly humiliation, but also weirdly a bonding exercise.
Wow.
And mooning the master was more of a collective act, rebellion, defiance, where boys would expose their buttocks to a teacher.
As a group.
Often, yes. The key thing is that these were public accepted rituals within these closed male worlds. While they certainly had elements of dominance and sometimes humiliation, they also normalized a level of physical intimacy and, comfort with the male body that would definitely raise serious eyebrows today.
You can say that again.
They solidified group identity and, in a strange way, fostered this shared intense experience that could deepen emotional connections, even if it was through a lens of what you might call tender brutality.
Tender brutality. That captures it. It's almost hard to imagine that level of physical contact and these, frankly, bizarre rituals being considered normal without any sexual implication from our modern viewpoint. But if that was accepted, then our sources also touch on something truly fascinating and maybe disturbing: the erotics of discipline. What exactly are we talking about here? Because corporal punishment and eroticism aren't usually terms you hear in the same sentence.
No, it's a very uncomfortable but historically documented intersection. Corporal punishment, particularly flogging or caning, was common in these schools.
Right, part of the system.
Exactly. And the act itself, the bared backside, the physical force, the vulnerability of the punished boy, and importantly, the observation by peers, could, for some, become a site of homoerotic fascination.
So the context itself was charged.
Highly charged. It created this atmosphere where power, pain, nakedness, observation, it all combined. Your sources describe this as a kind of homoerotic gaze embedded within the actual disciplinary structure.
So it wasn't necessarily intended as erotic by the institution, but the very nature of the punishment could be interpreted or, well, experienced that way by individuals.
Precisely. And for some, repression itself could inadvertently transform this vulnerability into a form of bonding, particularly among those who shared the experience, whether as punishers or punished or observers. It highlights how these intense, often violent institutional experiences paradoxically created deep, complex, and at times sexually charged bonds between men, all within a system supposedly designed for strict moral and physical control. The sort of forbidden fruit aspect of the act was, in a way, made more potent by its clandestine nature and the institutional setting.
That's a really chilling insight into how desire can adapt and find expression even in the most repressive environments. Okay, moving beyond the school grounds, our sources also discuss how these intense male bonds showed up in contexts of war, what's described as the tender brutality of service. What kind of intimacy are we talking about when men are facing, life and death together?
Yeah. The trenches of World War I in particular became another kind of furnace for male intimacy, but maybe of a different sort. Under the extreme duress of combat, personal space just collapsed.
Completely gone, I imagine.
Utterly. Men lived, slept, and often died within inches of each other. This naturally led to incredibly intense emotional connections, where camaraderie became fused with profound physical closeness.
It had to, right? For survival.
Absolutely. Soldiers shared bunks, shared their last rations, and crucially, they shared their deepest fears, their emotional confessions under this constant threat of death.
Yeah.
These were bonds of survival, of shared trauma, yes, but they were also deeply affectionate. Sometimes, maybe even explicitly homoerotic, in a way that defied typical societal norms back home.
How did that affection manifest?
Well, this intense brotherhood often involved tender physical gestures, holding each other, comforting someone breaking down, even carrying injured comrades for miles. It blurred the lines of platonic affection in a way that, again, modern society might struggle to categorize neatly.
So in these extreme circumstances, the usual social barriers just kind of evaporated. It makes perfect sense that such profound shared experiences would forge these almost unbreakable bonds. How do we actually see these feelings, these complex intimacies, recorded? Our sources point to letters and diaries as crucial windows. What do they reveal? And maybe more importantly, what did they leave unsaid?
Oh, these primary sources are absolute gold mines. But yeah, they require careful reading. Letters between male students, or later between war comrades, for instance, often use this incredibly ardent, highly stylized language.
Like really emotional.
Very. Language that modern readers might immediately interpret as romantic or sexual. They declared intense devotion, spoke of longing, expressed deep emotional dependence. Yet at the time, this was often understood as sincere, non-sexual friendship. It was culturally underpinned by classical ideals, the devotion between David and Jonathan from the Bible, things like that.
So the cultural context allowed for that kind of expression between men.
To a degree, yes. Figures like Rupert Brooke or Siegfried Sassoon, for example, penned letters filled with passionate declarations to other men. These bonds were often born in those elite educational settings we talked about, or massively intensified by the shared crucible of war.
But what about what they didn't say? You mentioned silences.
Right. What they don't always say explicitly about sexual acts is also very telling. The silences in these documents, the gaps, are as significant as the words. They reflect the repressive environment where any direct expression of same-sex desire was legally condemned and, frankly, highly dangerous. It was often an open secret, perhaps communicated through subtle coding, shared glances, implicit subtext, rather than outright declarations.
That's fascinating that even what's omitted speaks volumes. It kind of brings us neatly to the Victorian era, where this ambiguity around male intimacy seemed to change dramatically. Our sources talk about the creation of the homosexual closet, What was the driving force behind this really profound and repressive shift?
This was a systematic creation, really. It wasn't accidental. It was driven by government, by politicians, by a sensationalist press feeding public anxiety, same-sex desire, which had previously been viewed primarily as transgressive acts of sodomy rather than a core identity.
Right, the act versus the person.
Exactly. That desire became increasingly visible, or at least perceived as such, and was now being termed the secret vice, or famously, the love that dare not speak its name. The legal landscape hardened significantly. While the old Buggery Act of 1533 had long criminalized sexual acts between men, punishable by death originally,
Yeah, incredibly severe.
the pivotal change was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. This introduced the infamous Labouchere Amendment, and that criminalized a much broader range of gross indecency between men, critically even without intercourse. The penalties were up to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor.
Wow. That's a powerful and truly frightening shift. This wasn't just about specific acts anymore. It was about potentially criminalizing any intimate interaction between men if deemed indecent. That must have fundamentally reshaped how male affection could be expressed, surely.
Absolutely. It significantly increased vulnerability. It drove activities and even just expressions of desire much further underground. High-profile cases like Oscar Wilde's trials in 1895 or the artist Simeon Solomon's arrest back in 1872. These had devastating public consequences.
Made examples of them.
Exactly. They served as stark warnings. And this legal crackdown coincided with the solidification of that stiff upper lip ideal of masculinity. And crucially, the conceptualization of homosexuality as an identifiable condition or inversion, rather than just a sin or a choice.
So the identity started to form, but in a negative way.
Precisely. The closet became a societal imposition. It transformed previously ambiguous behaviors like intense friendships or physical closeness into forbidden fruit that had to be meticulously concealed. Any overt male affection, even seemingly platonic gestures, suddenly became suspect.
And how did class fit into this increasingly complex and repressive picture? Was the closet experienced differently across society? Did wealth or status offer any protection?
Definitely, it wasn't uniform. The upper class, often having had that classical education we mentioned, they had a cultural model from ancient Greek and Roman texts that was, perhaps surprisingly, a bit more tolerant of same-sex relations, or at least viewed them differently.
Less moral panic.
Left moral panic, perhaps, and more discretion. As long as they avoided public scandal, their affairs, even with men, were often tolerated to a degree. Their social standing, their connections, often offered a layer of protection that others didn't have.
Right. What about other classes?
Well, the burgeoning middle class, with its heavy emphasis on respectability, discipline, moral principles, they felt immense pressure to suppress or hide any desires that could jeopardize their social standing, their family's reputation. The stakes were very high for them.
Then the working class.
For working class men, masculinity was often linked more directly to industrial work, valuing physical strength, cooperation, camaraderie on the job. Their bonds, formed in the workplace or tight-knit communities, provided a robust framework for identity and affectionate friendships. Research suggests their experiences didn't always conform neatly to the modern homosexual trajectory seen in other classes.
So many different pressures, different expressions.
Possibly. And it also meant that working class men who engaged in same-sex acts might form more overt subcultures, like those gathering in Molly houses back in the Georgian era. While that fostered community, it also made them much more visible and vulnerable to police raids and prosecution. Upper-class men could often maintain greater discretion, which leads to a potentially skewed historical record. We hear more about those who got caught.
That makes sense. We only see the ones who surfaced, often negatively. Okay, so we've seen how male intimacy went from these passionate, accepted friendships through clandestine subcultures, then to severe legal crackdowns and the systematic creation of the closet. Now, as we approach the 20th century, our sources describe another profound shift towards medicalization. What does that actually mean for how male intimacy was understood? And how did it change the stakes yet again?
This is another truly seismic shift. Same-sex desire moved from being primarily framed as an immoral sodomy, a sinful act, to being seen as an innate pathological, medical, or psychological condition.
From sin to sickness.
Precisely. The term homosexual itself, coined back in 1869 by Caroline Maria Kerpeny, really marks a crucial step in this process. Then you had influential psychiatrists and sexologists like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Albert Moll. They began to classify what they termed deviant sexual behaviors.
Putting labels on everything.
Exactly, shifting the focus from temporary moral failings or choices to inherent, often seen as morbid conditions. Homosexuality was formally classified as a mental disorder in medical texts.
So it went from being a crime punishable by law to being a disease treatable by doctors. That sounds like a different kind of imprisonment in a way.
It was indeed. This medicalization, while sometimes framed as advocating treatment over harsh punishment, became an incredibly powerful new mechanism of social control.
How so?
It pathologized a whole segment of the male population, justifying intense scrutiny, intervention, and the search for cures. Crucially, it fundamentally redefined normal masculinity. Those previously accepted affectionate behaviors, holding hands, sharing beds, intense emotional declarations, things we discussed as commonplace in earlier centuries.
Yeah, the stuff from boarding schools even.
Right. All that now became highly suspect. It could be interpreted as a sign, a symptom of an underlying pathology. The stiff upper lip ideal solidified even further, making open expressions of love or deep emotional bonding between men seem not just socially undesirable, but potentially medically abnormal and dangerous.
Wow, so the fear wasn't just legal or social anymore, it was also medical. Fear of being labeled.
Exactly. Fear of being labeled gay, invert, perverse. This led to a widespread avoidance of overt emotional bonding and physical affection between men, even among those who wouldn't identify as homosexual. It policed everyone's behavior.
That's a powerful and lasting legacy. You can absolutely still feel echoes of that today. But amidst all this increasing repression and medicalization, were there any counter movements, any pockets of resistance where people pushed back?
Yes, there were, though, as you might expect, they were often largely confined to privileged intellectual and artistic circles where norms could be challenged more easily. The Bloomsbury Group, active in the early 20th century, really stands out as a significant counter-narrative.
Oh, yes. Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey.
Exactly. This collective of artists and writers, they famously lived in squares and loved in triangles, didn't they? They openly embraced same-sex desire alongside heterosexual relationships, challenging the rigid binaries being imposed. Figures like Lytton Strachey, Duncan Grant, John Maynard Keynes, they were central to this profoundly queer experiment, as some historians call it.
So they just lived differently.
They did, relatively openly within their circle. Their existence, even if somewhat insulated by their social standing and intellectual clout, showed that alternative forms of intimacy, alternative ways of living and loving were indeed possible. It pushed against those rigid societal norms. It reminds us that history is rarely monolithic. There are always countercurrents, even in times of severe repression.
That's a really important point. So what does all of this mean for us then, looking back at this incredible and often, frankly, heartbreaking arc of British male intimacy? We've journeyed from passionate, accepted friendships through clandestine subcultures and severe legal crackdowns to the systematic creation of the closet and the medicalization of desire. It's a truly complex narrative, isn't it?
It truly is. The historical journey reveals a deeply contradictory story. And the confusing nature of male bonds, as your sources put it, persists largely because of this historical fluidity, this constant shifting, and also because of the enormous challenges of applying our contemporary terms and understandings to past phenomena.
Yeah, the labels just don't always fit.
They don't. Those legal prescriptions, acting like that forbidden fruit, and the evolving social norms, they profoundly shaped how male intimacy was expressed, and critically, how it was perceived by others and by the men themselves. The very silence in those letters we talked about, the coded language, it's all testament to that pressure.
And the legacy.
The historical, legal, and medical frameworks, particularly the institutionalization of homosexuality as this specific stigmatized identity, have had a profound and lasting impact. It shapes how we understand acceptable expressions of male intimacy even today.
How so, specifically?
Well, that modern discomfort or taboo surrounding physical affection between men who identify as straight, the anxiety that sometimes manifests in phrases like no homo, that's arguably a direct legacy of the Victorian closet and the pathologization of male same-sex desire. Even the emergence of the term bromance in the 2000s, you could argue, explicitly tries to carve out a space for intense male friendships without the perceived implication of homosexuality. It's trying to navigate that historical baggage.
That's a powerful connection to our present day, and it leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you listening. Given how dramatically the understanding and expression of male intimacy have changed over these centuries, how do you think we, as contemporary observers, should approach these historical bonds? Are we simply projecting our modern notions of queerness onto the past, maybe flattening historical nuance in the process? Or through careful historical inquiry like this, are we actually uncovering what was always there? Perhaps just veiled, unacknowledged, or simply expressed in ways that we now struggle to fully understand?
That's really the core question, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
what queer historiography constantly grapples with. The ongoing work aims to illuminate historical queer culture, queer lives, queer achievements, broadening the discussion beyond just the famous figures or the scandals, and constantly challenging those ingrained heteronormative assumptions about the past.
It's about seeing the full picture.
Exactly. Understanding this intricate, often messy past is absolutely essential, not just for appreciating the full diversity of male experience across time, but also for challenging those lingering societal assumptions about masculinity and intimacy that we all inherit, consciously or not, to this very day. Homosexuality in British rugby. So our mission today really is to trace British rugby's, let's say, complicated journey. From a past filled with exclusion towards, well, what they're trying to do now for LGBTQ plus inclusion. We want to pull out those surprising bits and the moments that make you go, aha,
Yeah.
giving you the shortcut to really getting what's going on.
Yeah, and it's quite something how rugby's history is just so tied up with these traditional ideas of what it means to be a man. Often that meant quite open homophobia, unfortunately. But then, the turn of the 21st century, things really started shifting in the UK. Attitudes towards homosexuality changed fast, and that had a huge knock-on effect for the sport. It sort of forced rugby to adapt.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. Rugby's always had this prominent place in British culture, hasn't it? Kind of defining masculinity. And that usually meant, well, white, middle-class, able-bodied guys, and crucially for us today, heterosexual guys.
That was the stereotype, absolutely.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This traditional setting often had quite blatant homophobia, right? Baked into club traditions.
Yeah, things like post-match rituals, initiation ceremonies.
Right, like excessive drinking, stripping new players, singing, pretty offensive songs.
Yeah, explicitly mocking women on one hand and homosexuals on the other. That's documented.
And this is the twist, these same players were also known for, well, stripping naked together, engaging in behavior with teammates that seems quite homoerotic, especially during these initiations. So what's going on there? How do you square that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How can you mock homosexuality but also do things that look homoerotic? I think the key insight here is that it was a really complex performance of masculinity.
A performance.
Yeah, like maybe the homoerotic stuff was a way to show extreme maleness or build intense bonds in this very closed male group. Almost like paradoxically proving how heterosexual they were because they could do these things without any real implication,
Okay.
And at the same time, the mocking of gay people acted as a clear boundary. It reinforced the heterosexual norm against them, the other. It's, quite a performative tension looking back.
Right. And this wasn't just happening inside rugby clubs in isolation, was it? The whole country was changing.
Exactly. You can't separate it from the wider UK context. I mean, historically, the laws were incredibly harsh. You had the Buggery Act way back in 1533, death penalty for male anal sex.
Wow.
And then the Labouchere Amendment in 1885 broadened that to any homosexual act between men. Things started shifting slowly with the Wolfenden Report in 57, but the real acceleration has been post-2000. LGBTQ plus rights got much stronger, like the Equality Act 2010 offering broad protection against discrimination, and public opinion just soared. By 2019, you had, 86% saying homosexuality should be accepted, and huge support for same-sex marriage, too.
Okay, so society's changing rapidly. How did that start to filter down into rugby specifically? What happened with, say, gay rugby clubs?
Well, it's interesting. Back in the 70s and 80s, studies showed gay men often felt pretty negative about sport. And those early gay rugby clubs, like the ones Price and Parker looked at around 2002, they were mostly set up as a refuge, really.
To escape homophobia.
Yeah, perceived or actual homophobia in mainstream clubs. But now, because society's more accepting, that's changed. People aren't joining these clubs primarily to escape anymore.
Oh, I join now.
It's become much more about the social side, the community, and also, interestingly, about protecting players who might not be quite match-ready physically, giving them a safer space to play, which actually suggests things have got better in mainstream rugby, that gay players are more accepted. It's a sign of normalization, really.
And you see these inclusive clubs popping up or growing, right? Like Conwy Dragons in Wales, Wessex Wyverns, and International Gay Rugby IGR, which started in 2000.
Exactly. IGR has been huge in promoting inclusive rugby globally and trying to stamp out discrimination.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to talk about individuals
Yeah.
because personal courage seems absolutely key here in driving change, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. The impact of high-profile figures coming out is immense.
Let's start with maybe the most famous, Gareth Thomas, former Wales captain, British and Irish Lion, comes out in 2009, the first openly gay pro rugby union player.
The huge moment.
And since then, he's been a massive advocate for LGBTQ plus rights. Got recognized as the most influential gay person in the UK in 2010, got a CBE. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing. He was attacked in a homophobic hate crime in 2018. And his response was quite remarkable, wasn't it? Choosing restorative justice.
Yeah, that was really significant. Instead of just punishment, trying to use dialogue to repair the harm, to educate, it speaks volumes about trying to tackle the root cause of prejudice.
Right. And then in 2019, he publicly shared that he's HIV positive but undetectable, aiming to fight that stigma too.
His whole journey, the struggle, and then the visibility, it puts a human face on it all, doesn't it? That choice of restorative justice, too, suggests a really strategic approach to dealing with this ingrained prejudice. It's not just about locking people up, it's about changing minds.
Then you've got Keegan Hurst in Rugby League,
Yeah.
first active player to come out back in 2015, spoke really openly about the inner torment, even suicidal thoughts, before he accepted himself. But the support he got was described as overwhelming.
Yeah, which is encouraging.
And Nigel Owens, the referee, record-breaking career, came out publicly in 2007. He also spoke about contemplating suicide because of the taboo, living a lie.
It's harrowing to hear.
But he said coming out was like being born again because the support was so strong.
When you connect all these stories, you see how crucial these public figures are. They act as catalysts. Their stories, the fact they were ultimately supported, it challenges that old school heteronormative culture head on.
Right.
And become these really powerful symbols. Proof that you can be openly gay and succeed at the very top of a sport seen as traditionally macho. It's that whole, if you can't see it, you can't be it idea in action.
We also had Sam Stanley in English Rugby Union coming out in 2017, another important step. But going back to Gareth Thomas's experience, while these guys mostly got support, that hate crime incident does show that acceptance isn't, well, universal, is it?
No, absolutely not. And that raises a really important totem. Where does that disconnect come from?
Yeah.
Often the immediate rugby community teammates, coaches, fans close to the game, they might be supportive. But the hate crime suggests prejudice still exists, maybe more in wider society or among people outside that immediate sporting bubble.
So it highlights the need for ongoing work.
Definitely. Vigilance, good reporting systems for abuse, and education that reaches beyond just the clubs and players themselves.
Okay, so given all that context, the history, the societal shifts, the individuals, how are the actual governing bodies in British rugby responding? What are they doing officially?
Well, on paper, they've made strong commitments. Take the RFU in England, for example. They talk a lot about fair treatment, equal opportunity, and they've got this framework. Understand, build, advocate, deliver. Sounds good, right?
Sounds good, yeah.
See,
But here's where it gets really tricky, isn't it? The whole issue around transgender athletes, especially trans women.
Exactly. This is where you see a major split. While they talk diversity, the RFU's actual policy for trans and non-binary players has been heavily criticized.
By groups like Stonewall.
Yeah. They argue it's exclusionary, relying on things like height and weight monitoring for trans women that they say are too simplistic, maybe not based on solid enough evidence, and developed without enough input from the community itself.
And it's similar in Wales and Scotland.
Pretty much. The WRU and Scottish Rugby have also updated their policies to essentially bar transgender women from playing full contact women's rugby. They cite World Rugby guidance and refer to best current medical and scientific evidence about physical differences.
That these moves haven't gone unchallenged.
Not at all. The Welsh government actually expressed significant concern. LGBTQ plus groups have called the policies discriminatory.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this divergence tell us?
It shows a clear trend across the UK and Ireland's rugby unions to restrict trans women's participation. It creates this real split within the LGBTQ plus inclusion efforts. Sexual orientation seems to be handled one way, but gender identity is being treated very differently.
Driven by concerns about fairness and safety.
That's the argument, yeah. A perceived clash between potential biological advantages and gender identity. And rugby is not alone here. You see similar debates and policy splits in English football, cricket. It highlights just how complex it is trying to balance different values, inclusion versus fairness, safety.
Okay, so policies are one thing, and clearly contentious. What about other initiatives? Things aimed at creating a more welcoming feel.
Yeah, there are definitely efforts there. Premiership Rugby, for instance, has a dedicated LGBTQ plus Pride Weekend round. They partner with IGR clubs. The RFL, the rugby league body, celebrates Pride Month, says it has zero tolerance for discrimination.
And there's that Rugby Pride 2025 initiative.
Right, linked to the Women's World Cup, run with Pride Sports, planning trans-inclusive events.
So lots of visible stuff, rainbow laces, themed weekends.
Exactly, which is great for visibility and allyship, but the question is, how deep does it go?
What do you mean?
Well, it's fascinating because even with these initiatives, you still see issues. Premiership Rugby's Pride Weekend still gets negative comments online. People still talk about clubhouses feeling unwelcoming. So it suggests there's sometimes a gap, right, between the official messages and campaigns, the top-down stuff, and the actual lived experiences or attitudes on the ground at the grassroots level. Symbolic gestures are important, definitely, but they don't automatically fix everything. They're not enough on their own.
Right. Let's unpack that a bit more then. Beyond the policies, beyond the famous names.
Yeah.
What's the day-to-day reality like for LGBTQ plus people actually involved in rugby?
Well, despite the progress, people definitely still run into discrimination, harmful stereotypes. I mean, historically, sport often was a hostile place for LGBT people. Many felt excluded either overt discrimination or just the stereotypes, not seeing anyone like them.
What really stands out for you regarding women's experiences in rugby?
Okay, so women's rugby is often described internally as being incredibly welcoming, really proud to celebrate all its players, regardless of sexuality. That's the internal culture.
Right.
But externally, it faces this massive stereotype that basically every woman who plays rugby must be LGBTQ plus, especially a lesbian.
Right, I've heard that kind of thing.
And that stereotype gets used almost like a slur against the sport, against the players. It makes things uncomfortable for everyone, for LGBTQ plus women, but also for straight women playing the game. It can even affect recruitment, the sport's image. So there's this real disconnect between the inclusive reality inside a community and these prejudiced ideas from outside.
And it's not just external views, but the actual physical spaces.
Clubhouses.
Yeah, that's a point that comes up. Some of the more traditional local clubhouses can feel pretty unwelcoming if you're LGBTQ plus, maybe very old school atmospheres. Perhaps no pictures of women's teams up, certainly no rainbow flag.
Creates a sense of not belonging.
Exactly. Queer women, especially if they bring a partner along, sometimes report feeling, stared at, scrutinized. It just adds to the discomfort.
And it sounds like these negative experiences can start really young, affecting whether people even get into sport.
Oh, absolutely. The roots often go back to school. Think about this. 1 in 7 LGBT pupils say they've been bullied in sports lessons. For trans pupils, it's nearly 3 in 10.
That's shocking.
And more than half hear homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic language frequently in PE. If you have those kinds of bad experiences early on, it can put you off sport for life, can it?
Yeah, understandably.
Plus, the very structure of sport, often strictly gendered teams, that itself is a barrier. It puts off about 19% of LGBTQ plus students in uni or college, and that jumps to 39% for trans students.
And the mental health impact.
It's huge. 63% of young trans people say being excluded from sport negatively affects their mental health. But on the flip side, when they can participate, 69% say it significantly improves their mental well-being. So the stakes are really high.
But, okay, amidst all these challenges, we did touch on some positive shifts earlier, didn't we?
You did, yeah. Like the changing role of gay rugby teams.
Yeah.
They started as safe havens from homophobia, but now they're more about social connection and, interestingly, physical safety for less experienced players. That does suggest that mainstream rugby is becoming more accepting of gay players, that overt homophobia might be less common than it was.
And here's another really interesting point that came up in the research, this idea of a generational divide.
Yes. Reports suggest younger male club members tend to be much more open, more welcoming than some of the older generations associated with the clubs.
So what does that tell us, big picture?
Well, connecting that to the bigger picture, it suggests that maybe, just maybe, progress will happen more naturally over time as generations change, as older attitudes fade out and younger, more progressive views become the norm. But it also highlights that there are probably tensions right now, and it underlines why you still need targeted education, work on club cultures to bridge that gap and make sure acceptance is consistent across the board, not just patchy or dependent on age.
Okay, We've really covered a lot of ground here. It's been a deep dive into this really complex evolution of homosexuality and inclusion in British rugby. We've seen how a sport so tied to traditional, rigid ideas of masculinity has been challenged and how it's changing, largely thanks to, well, society changing around it, but also the immense courage of people like Gareth Thomas, Keegan Hurst, Nigel Owens.
Yeah, what's fascinating is you see clear progress, definitely. Especially for gay and lesbian players, a whole shift in gay rugby clubs proves that. But the journey's obviously not over. The whole transgender participation issue is still really contentious, unresolved. And you've still got those challenges right down at the grassroots, where the big campaigns and rainbow flags don't always filter down into everyday experience or get rid of those deep-seated biases.
So what's the takeaway for you, our listener? I think this deep dive really reminds us that changing policies, having inspiring public figures, that's crucial. But real, deep-rooted inclusion, that needs constant work on multiple levels. It's got to go beyond just the visible stuff, tackle hidden biases, change attitudes person by person, and really transform those local club cultures. And maybe, just as a final thought to leave you with, think about that paradox we started with. Those old school, seemingly homoerotic rituals in traditional rugby clubs, they were meant to reinforce heterosexuality, right? A kind of extreme masculine performance. But could they, maybe in some strange, twisted way, have inadvertently laid a tiny bit of groundwork, made the idea of male physical closeness, male affection, slightly more present, even if distorted? Could that perhaps eventually make it easier for genuine, authentic male affection to be more openly embraced in the sport down the line? It's just a thought how even the most rigid systems might contain these weird little seeds of their own potential change. Something to ponder.